Hello, my friend, and welcome to the Sleepy Scholar. Tonight, we are not going to talk about anything that needs remembering. We are going to talk about something much older and much softer than that, the night itself, as it used to be lived. Long before electric light pushed the darkness back into the corners, before clocks divided the hours into hard little cubes, people slept in a world that breathed differently than ours does. Tonight's subject is how medieval peasants actually slept. Not the version you might imagine from movies, all torches and misery, but the real, quiet, textured truth of it. A world of straw and firelight, and two separate sleeps in one long night, of nightcaps and hearths, and the sound of an owl somewhere past the window shutter. It is a small, human thing, sleep. And yet, it holds an entire civilization inside it, folded up like a blanket at the foot of a bed. If you've had a long day, and most days are long in their own quiet way, you don't need cosmic mysteries tonight, or ideas that ask anything of you. You just need somewhere gentle to rest your attention while your body does what it already knows how to do. So we'll wander gently through the centuries tonight, without hurry, without a destination we need to reach. There is nowhere else you need to be. Nothing here is a test. You can let your focus come and go exactly as it likes, and the story will still be here, waiting for you, whether you're listening closely or already half gone into sleep. Before we begin, if these gentle journeys ever help you drift off, it means a great deal to leave a like or to subscribe, not for any reason beyond helping other sleepy souls find their way here too, the way you found your way here tonight. And now, let's get comfortable. Let your body soften into whatever is holding you right now, the mattress, the couch, the pillow under your head. There is no correct way to lie here. Just let yourself settle into whichever shape feels least effortful. Let your shoulders drop an inch further than they're used to. Let your jaw loosen, your tongue rest heavy in your mouth, your forehead smooth out like water going still. You don't need to follow every word I say. You don't need to remember a single fact by morning. Nothing about tonight is a test, and nothing will be asked of you afterward. If your mind wanders off into its own private rooms halfway through a sentence, that's all right. That's actually what this is for. Your mind is a prediction machine, quietly trying to make sense of everything that happened today, and it can be hard for it to slow down on its own. Think of my voice as a kind of gentle hand on its back, not pulling it anywhere, just letting it know it's safe to stop working so hard now. Let your breathing slow, all on its own. No need to control it. Let it come a little longer, a little lower, sinking down into your belly instead of staying high in your chest. There's nothing to hold onto and nothing to chase. So let your mind drift, loose at the edges as we begin. Long before there were clocks on walls, most people slept according to something older and stranger, the dark itself. In medieval Europe, for most of the year, The sun set early and the sun rose late, and in between stretched a genuine, total darkness that almost none of us have ever experienced. No streetlights, no glowing phone screens, no distant highway glow on the horizon. Just black, complete and total, broken only by starlight, by moonlight on good nights, and by the small orange breathing of a hearth fire kept low and banked for the night. People's bodies responded to this differently than ours do. Without artificial light stretching the evening later and later, the natural signal to sleep arrived earlier, often not long after sunset, especially in the darker months. And so peasant households, tired from physical labor that modern bodies rarely know, tended to lie down for what researchers today sometimes call the first sleep, not long after dark settled over the fields. Somewhere in your own evenings, you might still feel an echo of this, a heaviness that arrives with the dark, even now, even with all our lights working against it. Tonight, if you feel that same old pull downward as the room dims, you are answering something very ancient in yourself. But that first sleep did not simply carry through until morning, the way we might expect. Sometime in the deep middle of the night, usually after several hours of that first sleep, many people in the medieval world would simply wake up. Not from noise, not from worry, but naturally, the way you might wake from a nap that had run its course. This waking was so ordinary, so expected, that it had its own name in several languages. The watch, or the watching, a quiet hour tucked between two halves of the night's sleep. There was no panic in it, no lying awake wondering what was wrong. It was simply understood that the night came in two pieces, with a soft hour resting between them like a seam. During this watching hour, a person might lie quietly beside the person next to them and talk in low voices about small things, dreams they'd just had, plans for the coming day, old memories drifting up unbidden in the dark. Some prayed. Some tended quietly to the fire, feeding it just enough to keep the coals alive until morning, without letting the flame grow too high. And then, in time, sleep would simply return again, and the second sleep would carry them on until the actual light of dawn. If you've ever woken in the middle of the night and felt a strange, unbothered calm about it, not the racing alarm of insomnia, but a soft, unhurried waking, some very old part of you may simply be remembering how this used to work. There was never anything wrong with it. The fire at the center of a peasant home was almost a member of the household in its own right. Most peasant homes were built around a single central hearth, often just a shallow pit of fire on a dirt or stone floor, sometimes with a hole in the roof above it to let smoke escape into the night sky. This fire did more than cook the evening's meal. It was the home's only heat, its only light after dusk. And crucially, its only defense against the true and total cold of a medieval winter night. Before the household lay down to sleep, someone would carefully s'more the fire, raking the coals into a small mound, covering them gently in ash, banking them low enough not to catch anything alight, but warm enough to survive until morning, ready to be coaxed back to flame with nothing more than a little kindling and patient breath. This nightly ritual of banking the fire was so universal across medieval Europe that a law grew up around it. In many towns, a bell would ring at a fixed hour each evening, a signal that it was time to cover your fire for the night, to keep sparks from drifting and burning down a village of wood and thatch while everyone slept. That bell and that law carried a French name that has quietly survived into English all the way to tonight. Couvre-feu. Cover the fire. You may recognize the word it eventually became, curfew. There is something tender in imagining an entire village, hundreds of small households, all performing the exact same small motion at roughly the same hour. Hands cupped gently around glowing coals, banking them down for the night, one after another, like a wave of quiet settling gently over the whole town. For most peasant families, a bed as we would picture one, a soft mattress lifted on a frame, simply did not exist. Instead, people slept on what was called a pallet or a tick, a large cloth or canvas bag stuffed with straw, hay, dried leaves, or, for the more fortunate, wool. This pallet might be laid directly on a raised wooden frame if the household could afford one, or simply on the floor itself, close to the warmth of the hearth. The straw would be changed out periodically. Fresh straw brought in from the harvest, the old straw removed and burned or composted. A small seasonal ritual tied to the rhythms of farming rather than the rhythms of hygiene as we understand it now. The wealthier a household, the softer its bedding tended to be feathers instead of straw, wool blankets instead of rough sacking, a proper wooden bed frame with rope lattice strung beneath the mattress to hold its shape. This rope lattice needed occasional tightening, pulled snug again as it slowly stretched and sagged with use. A small piece of practical maintenance that some believe echoes, even if only in folk memory, into a phrase we still say today when we tell someone to sleep tight. Whatever you're resting on tonight, however soft, however ordinary it feels to you, it is, in its own quiet way, an enormous luxury that most humans across history never had. You don't have to think about that with any weight or guilt. Just let it settle in you gently, like a small, unexpected gift you're only now noticing you were holding. Sleep in the medieval world was almost never a private, solitary act. In a peasant household, an entire family, parents, children, sometimes grandparents, sometimes an unmarried aunt or uncle, might share a single room, and often a single bed or a small handful of beds pushed close together for warmth. Children frequently slept 2, 3, or more to bed, tucked in alongside siblings, limbs overlapping in sleep, the whole small tangle of them sharing warmth beneath one blanket through the coldest months. In colder regions and seasons, farm animals themselves, a goat, a few chickens, sometimes even a cow, might be brought into the same single-room dwelling overnight, their body heat rising gently into the shared air, a warm, breathing addition to the household's collective warmth. This wasn't seen as strange or as a lack of privacy in the way we might feel it now. Privacy, as an idea, simply meant something different, or in many cases, meant very little at all to people whose entire lives were built around shared communal labor and shared communal rest. There's something quietly moving in picturing a small home glowing faintly with banked firelight, full of breathing bodies, human and animal both, all resting together against the same long, cold dark. Whatever solitude you may feel tonight, know that for most of human history, sleep was something done in the close, warm company of others, a soft huddle of shared survival. Even the poorest households understood the cold as sleep's oldest and most persistent enemy. Without central heating, without insulated walls, without the layered comfort of modern blankets and duvets, medieval nights, especially through the long, dark stretch of winter, could be brutally, dangerously cold. People developed an entire quiet science of staying warm through the night, most of it based on simple, elegant logic. Trap the air, layer the fabric, stay close together. One of the most enduring pieces of this science was the nightcap, not a drink, but an actual soft woolen or linen cap, worn snug over the head and ears through the night. A great deal of body heat is lost through the head and neck, and the nightcap addressed this directly. A small, humble piece of clothing doing an outsized job. Nightcaps were worn by peasants and nobles alike, by men, women, and children. A rare item of medieval life that crossed nearly every line of class and wealth. Beyond the nightcap, people layered whatever clothing they had, sometimes sleeping in the same woolen garments worn during the day, sometimes in a simple linen shift kept specifically for sleep. Extra blankets, when they existed, were piled thick. Bed curtains in wealthier homes could be drawn fully closed around the bed frame itself, creating a small enclosed pocket of warmer, still air, a bed within the room, a room within the house, a series of small nested shelters against the winter dark. If you're warm right now, wrapped in whatever is covering you, let yourself notice that warmth specifically, the way someone from that colder, harder world might have noticed it, not as a given, but as a small, hard-won comfort. There was something else worth resting on for a moment. The sky itself, once, did a great deal of the work our clocks do now. Without mechanical timekeeping In most peasant homes, people read the hour from the sky the way we might glance at a screen. The position of the sun told you roughly what time of day it was. The particular slant and color of the light told you how close you were to evening. And once true dark had fallen, the stars themselves, their slow wheeling rotation across the sky through the night, could tell an attentive, sky-literate person roughly how many hours had passed and how many remained before dawn. This was especially true for those whose work required tracking the night closely. Shepherds watching flocks through darkness, night watchmen patrolling town walls, or monks who structured their entire nightly rhythm around specific hours, marked not by any clock, but by prayer. There is a particular kind of quiet in imagining a person, centuries ago, lying on their back in a dark field or doorway, watching the same slow stars you might glimpse tonight if you stepped outside, using that same ancient, wheeling sky to understand exactly where they stood in their own night. The sky has always kept its own patient time, long before we built our own. Monasteries, in particular, built an entire architecture of sleep around interruption, and did so on purpose. Monks followed what's called the canonical hours, a series of set prayer times spaced across the full 24 hours of the day and night. Several of these fell deep in what would otherwise be the sleeping hours, most notably a service called matins, sometimes held as early as 2 or 3 in the morning. This meant that monks did not sleep one long, unbroken stretch at all. Instead, their night was deliberately divided. A period of sleep, then rising in full darkness to pray together by candlelight in a cold stone chapel, then returning to bed for more sleep before the true work of the day began at dawn. Rather than experiencing this as exhausting or cruel, this division of night into prayer-punctuated segments was understood as spiritually meaningful, a way of meeting God in the deep hours when the rest of the world lay unconscious, when the mind was said to be quieter, closer to something larger than the noise of ordinary daytime life. You don't need any particular belief to feel the shape of that idea tonight. The notion that the deep, quiet hours of night hold a kind of stillness the daylight simply doesn't have. Whatever is running quietly through your own mind right now, in this soft, in-between hour, may be touching something of that same old, unhurried quiet. For most peasants, sleep and the seasons were bound tightly together, shifting shape as the year turned. In summer, with its long daylight hours and demanding agricultural labor, planting, tending, and eventually the exhausting rush of harvest, peasants often slept less overall, rising with first light and working until the sun genuinely set, their bodies driven by the urgent, narrow window of growing season. But in winter, with fields lying fallow and daylight shrinking down to just a handful of hours. Sleep patterns loosened and lengthened considerably. Some historical accounts suggest peasant households in deep winter might spend 10, 11, even 12 hours in bed across a single long night, not necessarily sleeping the entire stretch solidly, but resting, dozing, talking quietly in the dark, tending the fire, moving in and out of that first sleep and second sleep pattern with far more room to breathe. Your own body, even now, likely still carries some quiet echo of this seasonal shift, a pull toward more rest in the darker months, a lighter, easier wakefulness in summer, even if artificial light has blurred and softened that old rhythm almost past recognition. Whatever season, it is outside your window right now. Know that your body's want for rest tonight is not weakness or laziness. It's an old, old rhythm, older than clocks, older than electric light, reaching all the way back through centuries of bodies that rested exactly when the dark told them to. There is something else worth lingering on, the peasant fear of the night itself, and how gently it was managed. Full, true darkness, the kind almost none of us experience now, could hold real unease for medieval people. Thieves, wolves at the edges of a village, the simple disorientation of a moonless night with no light at all. These were reasonable, practical fears, not superstition alone. Many villages and towns responded with the office of the night watchman, a person whose entire job was to walk the streets through the dark hours, calling out the time, checking for fires, watching for danger, singing out short verses at each hour to reassure sleeping households that all, for now, remained well. Hearing that voice, calling softly through the dark streets, past midnight, and all is well, or some regional variation of the same reassurance, must have been strangely comforting. A single human voice, moving steadily through the town's sleep, keeping quiet watch so that everyone else didn't have to. Tonight, you don't need a night watchman calling out the hours for you to feel safe in your own dark. But if it helps, you can imagine one anyway. A slow, steady voice somewhere just outside your window, gently confirming again and again that all, for now, is well. Beyond simple fear of the dark, the medieval mind held a rich, complicated relationship with dreams themselves. Dreams were rarely dismissed as meaningless static, the way modern minds sometimes flatten them. Instead, they were often treated as messages, sometimes from God, sometimes from the dead, sometimes as warnings, sometimes as simple omens about the harvest or a coming marriage or a journey soon to be taken. Entire manuscripts, called dream books or somnial, circulated through the medieval world, offering interpretations for specific dream images, dreaming of losing teeth, dreaming of flying, dreaming of water, cataloging centuries of accumulated folk wisdom about what the sleeping mind might be trying to say. Physicians of the era, too, paid close attention to dreams, believing they revealed something about the body's internal balance. Its particular mix of what were then called the four humors. A dream full of fire and heat might suggest an excess of one humor, a dream of cold water, an excess of another. Sleep, in this view, wasn't simply rest. It was a nightly conversation the body was having with itself, one worth listening to carefully. You don't need to remember any dream you have tonight or interpret a single image from it. But if something drifts up from the depths while you sleep, know that people have been listening closely to exactly that kind of drifting, half-formed nighttime language for a very, very long time. Before sleep itself, medieval households often observed small, quiet rituals, a kind of bedtime architecture we might not recognize by name, but would probably recognize by feeling. A simple prayer, murmured softly before lying down. A final check of the fire, banking the coals low. Perhaps a small cup of warm, herb-infused drink. Chamomile, valerian root, hops, or lavender steeped in warm water or ale. Used specifically to ease a restless mind toward sleep. The same handful of plants modern research still quietly confirms have some genuine calming effect. Doors and shutters checked and secured, not out of anxious vigilance, but as a small, grounding ritual signaling to the whole body. The day is finished now, and it is safe to let go of it. These small rituals, repeated night after night in nearly the same order, likely worked the same way any bedtime ritual works. Not through any single ingredient or action, but through repetition itself, through the simple, deep comfort of a pattern the body comes to trust completely. If you have your own small ritual tonight, however small, however unremarkable it might feel to you, know that you're taking part in something extraordinarily old. Long before anyone understood why it worked, people were doing exactly what you're doing right now, signaling gently to their own tired mind that it's safe now to stop. There is another layer to this worth resting on. The peasant bed, humble as it was, could also be one of the most valuable objects a family owned. In a world with very few personal possessions, a good bed, especially one with an actual wooden frame, a feather mattress, or fine woven blankets, represented real, significant wealth. Wills and household inventories from the medieval period frequently list beds by name and by specific value, sometimes worth more than any other single item in the home. Beds were passed down deliberately, generation to generation, named explicitly in a parent's final wishes, given to a specific child as one of the most meaningful inheritances a peasant family could offer. There's something quietly moving in that, the idea that the very thing meant to hold your rest each night was also, simultaneously, one of the most treasured objects a family could pass forward through time. A bed wasn't just furniture. It was a small, physical vessel of care, carried from one generation into the next, still holding warmth long after the person who first slept in it was gone. Whatever you're resting on tonight, however ordinary it might feel, it is quietly doing the same old job that beds have always done, holding you gently while the world keeps turning outside. Travel, in the medieval world, complicated sleep in its own particular way. Anyone journeying between towns, merchants, pilgrims, messengers, depended on inns and roadside lodgings, and these came with their own strange customs around rest. Privacy, already a loose concept at home, all but disappeared on the road. Travelers frequently shared not just a room, but a single bed with complete strangers, an arrangement considered simply practical, even mundane, rather than remarkable. Innkeepers might fit 3, 4, sometimes more travelers into one bed for the night, sorted loosely by social class, arranged head to foot to fit as many bodies as possible into the available warmth. Pilgrims making long journeys to distant holy sites sometimes slept in far rougher conditions still: barns, church porches, open fields beneath nothing but sky. Their sleep entirely dependent on the goodwill of whichever village they happened to reach as darkness fell. And yet even these makeshift, uncertain nights carried their own quiet comfort. The knowledge that nearly every stranger understood, without question, the shared vulnerability of needing rest, and extended whatever small shelter they could offer. If you are safe and warm tonight in your own space, held by your own walls, let that safety register fully, even just for a moment. A kind of rest that countless travelers across centuries would have received as an unimaginable luxury. There's a smaller, stranger detail worth pausing on: the particular sounds that would have filled a medieval night. No engines, no electrical hum, no distant traffic. Instead, wind moving through thatch roofing with a particular dry whisper unique to straw. The occasional low complaint of livestock shifting in a barn or in the corner of a shared room. Owls, foxes, the distant call of some animal further off in the dark woods beyond the village edge. The soft creak and settle of a wooden bed frame. A baby's brief cry, quickly hushed. The low murmur of the watching hour conversation drifting between two people half awake in the dark. And beneath everything, always, the faint, steady tick and shift of a banked fire slowly working through its coals. This was a soundscape almost entirely made of breath, wood, weather, and animal life. Nothing manufactured, nothing electric, nothing urgent in the way modern night sounds so often are. Just the old, unhurried noise of a world quietly, patiently waiting for morning. If it's quiet where you are right now, Let yourself listen for a moment to whatever small sounds remain: a settling house, distant wind, your own slow breath. These are some of the oldest sounds a human ear has ever fallen asleep to. Something gentler now about how children experienced sleep in this world. Peasant children rarely slept alone and rarely slept in silence. They were tucked in among siblings, sometimes alongside a grandparent, who, freed from the physical labor expected of younger adults, often took on a particular nighttime role: the keeper of stories. In the dim, dying light of the hearth, a grandmother or grandfather might spend the last waking minutes of the evening telling half-remembered folk tales, warnings about wandering spirits, half-comic stories about foolish neighbors, or simple retellings of the day's small village events, dressed up gently into something closer to legend. This wasn't formal education. It was simply how a long winter evening naturally unspooled, work finished, fire banked low, bodies arranged close together for warmth, and one low, familiar voice carrying everyone gently toward sleep. Long before written bedtime stories existed as we know them, this oral, emberlit tradition was already doing exactly the same quiet work, using a calm, familiar voice to walk tired minds gently out of the day and into rest. In its own way, that's not so different from what's happening right now between us. A low voice, no particular urgency, carrying you gently toward the same old destination that grandparents by firelight have been guiding children toward for 1,000 years. There is a curious detail about medieval sleeping posture worth resting on for a moment. We tend to picture people lying flat, the way we sleep now, but medieval beds, and the pillows and bolsters that came with them were often arranged to prop the sleeper up at a noticeable incline, sometimes quite significantly upright. Long bolster pillows, thick and firm, ran the full width of the bed, supporting the back and shoulders in a semi-reclined position rather than a fully flat one. Some historians believe this was tied to health beliefs of the era, a fear that lying completely flat might allow bodily fluids to pool dangerously, or worse, that it too closely resembled the posture of the dead. Whatever the precise reasoning, sleeping semi-upright, propped against bolsters and pillows, was simply normal, unremarkable, the expected way to rest through the night rather than any kind of hardship. A body can learn almost any position as its natural one, given enough repetition and enough centuries. There's no need to adjust your own position right now on my account. Whatever way you happen to be resting is exactly the right way. Your body already knows precisely how it wants to be held tonight. Above you, above all of this, above every hearth and pallet and banked fire we've wandered through tonight, the sky itself has been doing something wonderfully constant. The same moon that watched over a straw-roofed peasant cottage 800 years ago rises over your own roof tonight, essentially unchanged. The same slow wheel of stars turns overhead, keeping the exact same patient, ancient time it always has. Whole centuries have passed beneath that sky. Plagues, harvests, wars, weddings, quiet, ordinary nights just like this one. And the sky itself simply continued on, steady, unhurried, indifferent to the noise below it in the very best, most comforting way. Whatever is weighing on you tonight, however large it feels, it is held inside something far larger still, something that has been holding far larger things than this, gently, for a very, very long time. There is something else worth noticing, tucked into the corner of medieval village life. The shared responsibility of staying warm didn't end with people and animals inside a single home. It extended outward, house to house, in small, quiet ways. In tightly packed medieval villages, homes were often built close together, sharing walls or standing near enough that the warmth of one hearth might genuinely radiate faintly into a neighboring structure. Villagers looked out for one another's fires, almost as a form of collective insurance. A banked hearth gone wrong could threaten an entire street of thatched roofs. So a quiet, informal watchfulness passed between neighbors, an unspoken agreement that everyone's rest depended a little on everyone else's care. There's a kind of comfort in that, the idea that sleep, even in its most private, personal form, has always been something communities protected together. A shared responsibility stretched quietly across an entire sleeping village. No one fully alone in the dark. Something smaller now, easing further into the soft middle of the night. Peasant homes, especially the poorest, were often single rooms, no walls dividing bedroom from kitchen from anything else. Everything happened in the one space. Cooking, eating, working, praying, sleeping. When it came time to rest, the same room that had held the day's noise and labor simply transformed, quietly, into a sleeping space. A few pallets unrolled, the fire banked low, voices dropping to murmurs, and the whole small world of the household settling down together into the dark. There's something gentle in that lack of division, no separate room to retreat to, no door to close between awake and asleep. Just one space, holding the whole of a life, day folding softly into night within the very same four walls. Let your own space do something similar right now. Let it hold you exactly as you are awake, half awake, drifting, without needing you to be any particular way before it lets you rest. Something else, quieter still. Not every peasant slept in a home with four solid walls and a hearth. Shepherds, particularly through lambing season, sometimes slept outdoors for days or weeks at a stretch, close beside their flocks, using nothing more than a cloak, a simple lean-to, or a shepherd's hut on wheels for shelter. Their sleep was lighter by necessity, half listening always for a wolf, a storm, a lamb in distress, yet also, in its own way, deeply connected to the natural rhythm of the land around them, waking with first light, settling as true dark fell. No clock at all, just the sky and the animals, and the old, worn patience of the work itself. There is something quietly humbling in imagining a person lying under open sky, no roof at all between them, and the same stars you might glimpse tonight, trusting the night to hold them the way it always had. And a little further still, into something almost forgotten. In some regions, particularly colder ones, a custom existed of bundling courting couples, fully clothed, sometimes sleeping in the same bed under the watchful, practical logic of families, with no spare room to offer for a suitor's overnight visit. A board or rolled blanket sometimes placed between them as a simple, physical boundary. It was less romantic gesture than practical solution, a way of allowing courtship to happen indoors, out of the brutal cold, without abandoning the household's expectations. History remembers it now as a curious footnote, but at the time, it was simply one more small, sensible adaptation to a hard climate and a crowded home. Nothing about your own night tonight needs any particular arrangement or custom. Just rest, however it finds you, however it happens to arrive. Softer now. Peasant sleep clothing, when it existed at all separately from daytime clothing, was usually simple. A long linen shift, worn loose. Sometimes the only garment separating skin from the rough straw and wool of the bed itself. Poorer households sometimes had no separate sleep clothing whatsoever, simply sleeping in whatever they'd worn through the day. The line between day clothes and night clothes nearly non-existent for those with the fewest possessions. There's something almost freeing in that lack of distinction. No elaborate preparation required, no separate wardrobe of rest. Just the same body, the same simple cloth, moving directly from the day's labor into the night's stillness, with barely a pause between the two. Quieter again. Even bed bugs and other small pests were an accepted, almost unremarkable part of medieval sleep. An old, persistent nuisance that herbalists and household manuals addressed with the same practical, unbothered tone used for any other small household chore. Sprigs of certain herbs, pennyroyal, wormwood, were sometimes tucked into bedding, believed to discourage insects. A small nightly act of quiet household maintenance folded into the larger ritual of preparing a bed for rest. There is nothing romantic in that particular detail, only truth. And there's something oddly comforting in truth itself, in knowing that even in imperfectly kept beds, across centuries of small, persistent nuisances, people still managed, night after night, to find their way down into rest. Gentler. Certain plants held a particularly trusted place in the medieval approach to difficult, restless nights. Lavender, tucked into small linen sachets and placed beneath a pillow. Hops, brewed lightly into a warm drink. Chamomile, perhaps the single most widespread and enduring sleep aid across the entire medieval world, steeped and sipped slowly in the last quiet minutes before lying down. These weren't understood through modern chemistry, through any known idea of what we'd now call sedative compounds. They were simply trusted, generation after generation, because generation after generation had found, quietly and repeatedly, that they worked. If a warm, gentle drink has ever helped ease you toward sleep, you are, in your own small way, continuing something that stretches back for centuries. A very old, very human trust in small, simple things. Softer still, there is something quietly moving in imagining an entire medieval village at almost the exact same hour each night, going through nearly identical motions, banking fires low, murmuring final prayers, drawing children in close, settling onto straw and wool. Hundreds of small, separate households, each entirely unaware of how closely their private nighttime ritual mirrored every other household's, all moving together, unknowingly, into the very same shared dark. There is a kind of quiet company in that, even now. Somewhere out there tonight, in your own time, countless other people are doing almost exactly what you're doing right now, settling down, letting a voice or a stillness carry them toward rest. You are not really doing this alone, even in the quietest, darkest hour. Even more slowly now, the transition out of that first sleep and into the second, the watching hour we spoke of earlier, carried its own small, private customs worth returning to gently. Some medieval physicians actually recommended this natural waking period as an ideal time for study, for quiet reflection, or for what they delicately called getting children, believing the body, rested from its first sleep, but not yet fully returned to wakeful business, was in some particularly suitable state for such things. Whatever this hour was used for talk, prayer, quiet intimacy, or simply lying still in the dark, it was never treated as a problem to solve. It was simply one more soft, expected room inside the larger house of the night. Slower. Even illness and sleep were understood differently in this world. A restless, broken night was sometimes read as the body working through something, an imbalance correcting itself, a fever breaking the humors back into order through sweat and disturbed rest. Sleep wasn't only passive rest in this view. It was, in its own way, active repair, the body's nightly labor, every bit as real and necessary as the day's labor in the fields. Whatever your body is doing right now, however visible or invisible that work might feel to you, know that it is exactly this quiet, necessary repair, happening whether or not you're aware of it. Slower still, even the earth beneath a medieval peasant's home did its own small part in the night's warmth. Homes were frequently built with earthen floors, sometimes packed dirt, sometimes simple stone, materials that held heat from the day's fire far longer than we might expect, releasing it back slowly through the night. A kind of natural, ancient underfloor warmth working quietly beneath every sleeping body above it. The ground itself, in its own patient way, was helping. It still is, in its own way, right now, the same old earth, still turning slowly beneath you, still holding warmth and cold in its own vast, unhurried rhythm. Quieter. There's a particular comfort in imagining the very last motion of a medieval household's day. Not words, not prayer, but simply hands. A final touch to a banked fire. A blanket pulled higher over a child's shoulder. A door checked, a shutter latched. Small, wordless gestures repeated almost identically across 1,000 nights, across 1,000 different households, each one a tiny, private closing ceremony marking the end of labor and the beginning of rest. If you have a gesture like that tonight, however small, let it happen now, gently, without needing to think about it. Just let your body do what it already knows to do. Quieter still, above the smallest peasant cottage and the grandest stone keep alike, the same long medieval night settled equally, indifferent to wealth or status. Kings slept beneath feather and velvet, peasants slept beneath straw and wool, but both, in the end, surrendered to the exact same darkness, the exact same slow turning of stars, the exact same simple, universal need to rest. There is something quietly leveling in that. Whatever separates people by day, the night has always gathered everyone back into the very same soft, shared need. You, too, are held inside that very old, very simple equality tonight. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The village bell did more than mark the evening curfew. It shaped the whole architecture of a peasant's day, right up until the very edge of sleep. In most medieval parishes, a bell rang out several times daily, calling people to a brief moment of prayer known as the Angelus, often once at dawn, once at midday, and once again as the light began to fail in the evening. That final ringing served as a kind of soft, communal punctuation mark at the close of the day's labor, a signal to straighten from the field or the loom, to murmur a short prayer wherever you stood, and to begin, without any real urgency, making your way home toward the fire and the coming dark. Whole villages, scattered across fields and lanes, would pause together at the very same moment, connected by nothing but sound traveling through evening air. There is something quietly steadying in imagining that single bell note drifting out over rooftops and furrows alike, reaching every ear in the village at once, gently announcing that the working day was closing and the resting one was about to begin. If you have any small, private signal of your own tonight, a dimming lamp, a closing book, the particular quiet of this very voice, it is doing something very similar to that old bell, marking the same soft threshold between doing and resting. There is another detail worth lingering on, tucked into those last waking hours before sleep. Many households didn't simply sit idle by the fire once the day's outdoor labor ended. Instead, the evening often shifted into quieter, seated work, spinning wool into thread, mending torn cloth, carding fleece, weaving narrow bands of trim, all done by touch and firelight rather than close, focused sight, since the fire gave barely enough light to see fine detail by. This kind of handwork became, almost by accident, a kind of collective wind-down ritual. Hands stayed busy in slow, repetitive motions, the same small gesture over and over, spinning wheel humming softly, needle moving in and out of cloth, while conversation dropped low and unhurried, drifting between neighbors gathered close, or simply between members of one tired family. The repetition of the work itself, rhythmic and undemanding, likely helped ease bodies and minds toward the sleep that would follow soon after. If your own hands are still tonight, doing nothing at all, that's all right too. But if you've ever noticed how some repetitive, undemanding motion can quiet a racing mind, you're recognizing something these firelit evenings understood instinctively, centuries before anyone had a word for it. Nearly every medieval village had someone people turned to for help with a restless night. Not a physician in the formal sense, but a wise woman, a local healer versed in herbs, remedies, and the particular quiet knowledge passed down mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, over generations. This local healer might recommend a specific tea for a fretful child, a particular poultice for aching limbs that kept a laborer from settling, or simply sit with a worried household for a while, offering calm reassurance alongside her remedies. Her knowledge wasn't written down in any grand text most of the time. It lived instead in memory, in practice, in the small, accumulated trial and error of an entire community's shared experience with sleeplessness and its many quiet causes. There is something comforting in knowing that every struggling sleeper in every century has had someone nearby who understood at least a little of what they were going through, and who offered whatever gentle help was available. Tonight, in a smaller way, you have that too. Water, in much of the medieval world, was not always safe to drink on its own, drawn as it often was from wells and streams shared with animals and neighboring households. As a result, many peasant families drank a weak, low-alcohol ale, sometimes called small beer, with their evening meal, brewed specifically to be mild rather than intoxicating, safer than untreated water, and gently filling after a long day's labor. This evening ale, taken calmly with supper rather than in any excess, likely carried its own small, warming effect as the household settled toward the fire and eventually toward sleep. Not enough to cloud the mind, simply enough to round off the sharper edges of a tiring day. It was less an indulgence than an ordinary, practical part of the evening meal, as unremarkable as bread itself. Whatever eases you gently toward rest tonight, a warm drink, a quiet room, simply the sound of a steady voice. Know that people have always looked for some small, ordinary comfort to help carry them the last short distance into sleep. There is something else worth resting on, drawn from the colder northern reaches of medieval Europe. The longhouse, a single long, low building that might hold an entire extended family, their livestock, and their stored harvest, all beneath one continuous roof, divided only by low partitions rather than solid walls. In the depths of a northern winter, this arrangement wasn't simply tradition. It was a deeply practical response to genuinely brutal cold. The combined body heat of people and animals alike, all sheltered beneath a single roof, made the difference between a survivable night and a dangerous one. Grandparents, parents, children, cousins, cattle, and sheep, all breathing quietly together in the dark, their collective warmth rising slowly to fill the same enclosed air. There's something almost startling in how literally communal that survival was warmth itself, shared and pooled and depended upon, night after night, by every living thing gathered beneath one roof. Whatever is keeping you warm tonight, know that warmth, at its oldest and most essential, has always been something living things have offered each other freely, without complication. During certain seasons, sleep bent to a different, more urgent rhythm entirely. At harvest time, when a narrow window of good weather could mean the difference between a full larder and a hungry winter, peasants sometimes worked deep into the night by the light of a particularly full, bright moon, a harvest moon, bright enough to work fields by, allowing labor to stretch past the usual boundary of full darkness. On these nights, sleep was simply deferred, pushed later, shortened without complaint, because the urgency of the harvest outweighed the usual gentle rhythm of the season. Once the crop was safely gathered and stored, though, the household's sleep would lengthen back out again, a kind of collective exhale after weeks of urgent, moonlit labor. There is something worth noticing in that flexibility. The way rest, throughout most of human history, has always adjusted itself to necessity, contracting and expanding as the demands of life required, trusting itself to return to balance once the urgent work was done. Even the straw pallet itself, humble as it sounds, involved its own small yearly craft. After the harvest, families would set aside a portion of dried straw specifically for bedding, choosing the cleanest, most tightly bundled stalks, and stuff it fresh into large cloth ticking to replace the old, flattened, worn-down straw from the year before. This yearly restuffing was often timed to the harvest itself, a small domestic ritual tucked quietly alongside the much larger agricultural one. Fresh straw held its shape and warmth far better than straw that had been slept on, night after night, for months, flattening slowly beneath the weight of sleeping bodies, until it offered almost no cushioning at all by the following summer. A family with a fresh, well-stuffed pallet, in a very real sense, was sleeping on the success of their own harvest, the two things quietly connected, one feeding directly into the comfort of the other. If your own bed feels particularly soft or welcoming tonight, there's a kind of old satisfaction in that, the sense of a year's labor, in some very old, distant echo, finally paying itself back in rest. Wealthier peasants, and the class just above them, yeomen, prosperous farmers, minor landholders, sometimes owned what was called a tester bed, a bed frame topped with a wooden canopy from which heavy curtains could be drawn fully closed around all four sides. Within a household that otherwise offered almost no privacy at all, these drawn curtains created something genuinely rare, a small, enclosed pocket of solitude and warmth, a room within a room, sealed off from the rest of the shared, single-space household. Drawing those curtains closed each night was likely its own small, satisfying ritual, the soft rasp of heavy fabric sliding along a wooden rail, the sudden hush and warmth of the enclosed space, the world outside reduced to muffled sound alone. For a family with little privacy in any other part of daily life, this nightly enclosure may have felt like its own small, treasured luxury. Whatever encloses you tonight, walls, blankets, simply the soft dark itself, let it hold you the way those old curtained beds once held their sleepers, closed off gently from everything else, for just this one stretch of hours. Morning, in the medieval world, arrived on 4 small feet and a very loud voice. The rooster's crow served as the most reliable, most universal wake signal a peasant household had, more dependable in many ways than any bell, marking the true, unmistakable end of the night's rest and the beginning of the day's labor. This small daily performance was so consistent, so trusted, that cockcrow became its own informal unit of time, referenced in legal documents, religious texts, and ordinary daily speech alike. An hour understood by everyone, requiring no clock at all, just the presence of a bird doing exactly what it always did, right on schedule, morning after morning after morning. There's something gently amusing, and also strangely moving in imagining an entire agricultural civilization organizing itself, in part, around the reliable enthusiasm of a rooster. Whatever wakes you gently tomorrow, an alarm, the light through a window, simply your own body finished with its rest. It will be continuing a tradition of trusted, natural signals, stretching back further than almost anything else we've spoken of tonight. Many households kept small, quiet customs meant to invite a peaceful night rather than ward off any particular fear. A pinch of salt left near the hearth, a particular herb tucked above a doorway, a small, murmured blessing spoken over the sleeping space before the last candle was extinguished. These weren't treated as urgent or anxious acts. They were closer to a soft, hopeful habit, the same instinct that leads someone today to fluff a pillow just so, or straighten a blanket one final time before finally letting themselves rest. There's a tenderness in that instinct. However it's expressed, this old, universal human wish to send oneself off gently into the dark with some small, deliberate gesture of care. Winter shortened more than daylight. It also shortened the available hours of artificial light, since candles, particularly beeswax candles, cleaner burning and pleasant smelling, but expensive, were a luxury few peasant households could afford in any quantity. Most made do instead with tallow candles, rendered from animal fat, smokier, dimmer, and considerably cheaper, or with simple rushlights, dried rush stems dipped in fat, burning low and short, needing frequent replacing through a long winter evening. Because of this, artificial light was used sparingly, carefully, saved mostly for essential tasks rather than idle evening hours. Once the fire burned low and the last rushlight guttered out, the household simply accepted the dark as the natural, expected close of the day. No lingering, no scrolling, no artificial extension of wakefulness. When the light was gone, it was, quite simply, time to sleep. There's a certain freedom in that old simplicity, light as a precious, finite resource rather than an endless, always available option. The ending of the day arriving naturally, without any real choice involved at all. The elderly held a particular, valued role within this nighttime rhythm. Freed by age from the heaviest physical labor, older members of a household often took on responsibility for tending the fire through the deepest hours of the night, waking naturally and lightly, as older bodies often do, to check the coals, add a little kindling if needed, and ensure the household's one true source of warmth didn't fail before morning. This wasn't treated as a diminishment. Some lesser task handed down once stronger labor was no longer possible. It was understood instead as genuinely essential work. Quiet, patient, absolutely necessary to the household's survival through a cold night, requiring exactly the kind of light, easily broken sleep that often comes more naturally with age. There's something worth noticing in that old, practical wisdom. The idea that every stage of a life carries its own particular usefulness, its own particular way of caring for those around it, even in the smallest, quietest hours of the night. When illness or the exhaustion of childbirth kept someone from their usual place in the household's rhythm, the wider community often stepped in, almost automatically, to protect that person's rest. Neighbors might take on extra chores, bring prepared food to spare a recovering household the work of cooking, or simply keep children occupied elsewhere for a few hours, so a tired new mother or a fevered laborer could sleep undisturbed. This wasn't organized through any formal system. It emerged simply from the tight, interdependent fabric of village life, where everyone's labor was, in some small way, everyone else's concern, and where protecting one person's rest was understood as protecting the whole community's ability to keep functioning. If you've ever been cared for during a difficult stretch, however that care arrived, you've received a very old kind of gift, one villages have been quietly offering each other in exactly this way for a very long time. Feast days and fairs, scattered through the medieval calendar, briefly upended the ordinary rhythm of sleep altogether. On these occasions, a saint's day, a harvest festival, a traveling fair passing through, villagers might stay awake far later than usual, dancing, feasting, listening to traveling musicians or storytellers. The entire community's sleep schedule shifting together for one bright, unusual night. And then, just as naturally, the ordinary rhythm would simply resume the following evening. Fires banked at the usual hour, bodies settling back into familiar patterns. The brief, joyful disruption absorbed easily back into the community's steady, dependable routine. Rest, it seems, has always made room for occasional exception, without losing its underlying shape. If tonight follows a day that was anything but ordinary, know that your body, too, knows exactly how to find its way back to rest, the same way it always has, the same way villages full of tired, happy dancers always eventually did. There is one last thread worth gently following before we close. That old rhythm of first sleep and second sleep, the watching hour resting quietly between them, didn't vanish because it stopped working. It simply faded slowly over centuries as artificial light grew brighter and more available, as clocks grew more precise and more central to daily life, as evenings stretched later and later into what had once been unquestioned dark. By the time electric light reached most homes, the two-part night had quietly disappeared from common memory almost entirely, replaced by the single, unbroken sleep most of us now consider simply normal. Though some researchers today wonder whether a small, persistent echo of that older rhythm still lives on in all of us, in every quiet, unbothered waking that sometimes still visits the deep middle of an ordinary night. There is something small and easy to overlook worth pausing on. Before bed, even in the humblest households, a simple washing ritual often took place. Not a full bath, which was rare and often reserved for special occasions, but a quick washing of the feet and hands in a basin of water warmed near the fire. This small act served a practical purpose, removing the dirt of a day spent in fields or lanes, but it likely carried a quieter, ritual purpose too. A final, physical marker that the day's labor was truly finished, that the body could now be handed over fully to rest. There's something worth noticing in that small transition. Water, warmth. A few unhurried minutes spent simply attending to your own tired body before letting it rest completely. Whatever your own version of that transition looked like tonight, however brief, it was doing the same old, patient work, closing one part of the day gently before opening the next. Even the light that lit these final evening rituals had to be made by hand, and the making of it was its own small, recurring chore. Households without the means for beeswax candles would spend part of an autumn evening dipping rushes, the dried, peeled stems of a common marsh plant, repeatedly through melted animal fat, building up thin, even layers until each rush could hold a small, steady flame for perhaps half an hour. Dozens of these rushlights might be prepared at once, stored carefully for the coming weeks. One more small store laid in against the coming dark, much like grain laid in against the coming winter. There's something quietly satisfying in that image. A family working together by the last of the daylight to manufacture their own small store of coming light. Each rush a tiny, patient promise that a little brightness would still be available on even the darkest nights ahead. Sleep, like nearly everything else in medieval life, was shaped by social hierarchy, even within a single household. In wealthier homes, a prosperous farmer's house, a minor manor family members typically slept in a private chamber, while servants and farmhands slept elsewhere. In the kitchen, near the last of the fire's warmth, in a hall on simple pallets, or in a loft above the animals they tended. This wasn't usually experienced as harsh or cruel by the standards of the time. It simply reflected the ordinary, accepted shape of a world organized tightly around rank and role. Even in its most private, unguarded hours. And yet, even across that divide, the underlying need remained exactly the same. Everyone, regardless of where they slept or how grand their bedding, was reaching for the very same rest at the end of the very same long day. The church bell that had called the village to evening prayer through the Angelus often rang once more, quieter and later, marking a final canonical hour called Compline, the very last of the day's formal prayers, traditionally said just before sleep. Even lay people who couldn't attend a full evening service in person often knew, simply by long habit, roughly when this final bell would sound, and treated it as an informal signal that the day was now truly complete. There's something gently final in the idea of an entire village oriented, once more, around a single shared sound. One last bell, ringing out just before the whole community settled into its shared and separate darkness. A soft closing note at the end of a long, common song. Certain folk beliefs concerned themselves with the smallest details of how a bed itself was arranged, which direction a sleeper's head should point. For instance, with some traditions favoring east, toward the rising sun, believed to invite a more peaceful, well-ordered night. Whether or not such beliefs held any real effect, they reflect something worth noticing: an old, careful attentiveness to sleep itself, a sense that rest deserved real thought and real care, not simply whatever arrangement happened to be most convenient. You don't need to worry about which direction you're facing tonight. Wherever you happen to be turned, it's exactly the right direction. The only real requirement for a peaceful night was always simply the intention behind it, not the compass point. Dogs held a particular valued place in many peasant households' nighttime arrangements, curled near the hearth or at the foot of a sleeping pallet, offering both warmth and an early, reliable warning of anything approaching the home in the dark. A stranger on the path, a fox near the henhouse, any small disturbance worth waking for. A dog's light, alert sleep complemented a household's own deeper rest, one keeping a kind of gentle watch so the rest of the family didn't have to. There's something old and comforting in that particular partnership. A household resting more easily, more completely, simply because another small, warm, watchful creature had agreed, in its own way, to share the responsibility of the night. Thatched roofs, common across most of peasant Europe, did more than simply keep out rain. Layers of tightly bundled straw or reed created genuinely excellent insulation, trapping warm air beneath the roofline through even harsh winter nights, while also softening outside sound in a particular, distinctive way. Rain falling on thatch produces a duller, gentler patter than rain on tile or slate, and wind moving through the layered straw carries its own soft, papery whisper rather than any harsh rattle. Falling asleep beneath such a roof, through a storm or a simple windy night, likely came with its own particular, textured soundscape. Something soft and organic rather than sharp, the whole house seeming to breathe gently along with the weather outside it rather than simply enduring it. If it's raining or windy wherever you are tonight, let yourself notice that sound for a moment, however it reaches you. It's a very old kind of company for a sleeping mind. Infants in this world were often swaddled snugly before sleep, wrapped firmly in long strips of soft cloth, arms and legs held gently close to the body. This practice, common across nearly every culture of the era, was believed to soothe a restless newborn, mimicking, in its close, secure wrapping, something close to the snug containment of the womb itself. And it often did seem to help small, unsettled infants find their way more easily into sleep. There's a tenderness in that old instinct, the understanding, even without any formal science behind it, that a body newly arrived in the world often rests more easily when it is held snugly, securely, without too much open space around it. Whatever is holding you snugly tonight, a blanket, the weight of the dark itself, it may be doing something quietly similar. During certain religious observances, wakefulness itself became, briefly, a form of devotion rather than an obstacle to overcome. Vigil nights, held before major feast days, or as part of mourning customs, or during particular seasons of religious observance, asked people to deliberately remain awake through some portion of the night, in prayer or quiet reflection, rather than surrender immediately to sleep. These nights were understood as temporary, deliberate exceptions to the ordinary rhythm, not a rejection of rest itself, but a chosen, occasional postponement of it, made meaningful precisely because sleep was, on every other ordinary night, so readily and gratefully received. The exception, in other words, only had meaning because of how reliably the rule held on every other night. Tonight is not one of those exceptions. Tonight asks nothing of your wakefulness at all, only permission, freely given, to let it go completely. Cats, too, earned their quiet place within the peasant home, valued less for companionship in the way we might think of them now, and more for their steady, nightly work, controlling the mice, and rats drawn to any household stores of grain. A cat curled near the hearth, or prowling quietly along the home's edges through the dark hours, was performing its own small, essential labor, even as the rest of the household slept, protecting the very food supply that would sustain everyone through the coming season. There's something fitting in that image, an entire household sleeping soundly, trusting, without needing to think about it, that some other small creature was quietly tending to the things that needed tending, even in the deepest, darkest hours of the night. Even the practical, unglamorous logistics of a shared sleeping space were handled with a certain quiet, unbothered simplicity. A chamber pot kept near the sleeping area spared a household the need to venture out into a genuinely dangerous winter night. The cold itself, a real hazard, not simply a discomfort, allowing sleep to be interrupted as briefly and gently as possible before returning quickly to the warmth of the bed. It was a small, sensible accommodation to a hard climate, handled without any particular embarrassment. Simply one more practical feature of how an entire household managed its shared night. There's nothing remarkable in that detail except its honesty. The reminder that even the most humble, ordinary logistics of rest have always mattered, have always been quietly solved in one practical way or another by every generation that came before this one. Not every fire in a medieval village was banked for the night in quite the same way. The village blacksmith's forge, essential to the whole community's tools and equipment, was sometimes kept smoldering at a low, careful burn through the night rather than fully extinguished, since relighting a forge fire from nothing took considerably more time and effort than reviving a simple household hearth. While most of the village slept in full darkness, that one low, steady glow might continue on through the night at the smithy's edge, a small, patient ember waiting for the dawn's work to begin again. There's something worth noticing in that quiet exception. The way even a sleeping village still held onto a few small points of continuity through the dark. A few fires that never fully went out, waiting patiently for morning to put them back to use. Snoring, unsurprisingly, was as universal then as it is now, and folk explanations for it were often as gentle and imaginative as they were unscientific. Some traditions held that a snorer was, in their sleep, quietly conversing with spirits or with the dead, their breath carrying half of a conversation the waking world simply couldn't hear. Rather than treating it as a nuisance to fix, some households simply accepted it as one more ordinary texture of a shared sleeping space, no different from the wind outside or the settling creak of the house itself. If someone near you tonight breathes a little louder in their sleep than you'd like, there's an old, oddly comforting tradition you could borrow. The idea that they're simply, quietly, having a conversation somewhere you can't quite follow, and that it's nothing at all to worry over. The moon held a particular, double-edged place in medieval imagination. Trusted, as we spoke of earlier, as a genuine practical aid for late-season labor and nighttime travel, but also, in certain folk beliefs, treated with a kind of wary respect, blamed occasionally for restless sleep, strange dreams, or unsettled moods, especially around its fullest phase. This wasn't cruelty or ignorance so much as an old, poetic instinct to find pattern and meaning in the sky's steady, visible changes. An instinct not so different, in its own way, from a modern person half-jokingly blaming a full moon for a strange night's sleep even now. Whatever the moon is doing in the sky tonight, full, half, entirely hidden behind cloud, you don't need to hold any belief about it at all. It will simply keep doing what it has always done, quietly indifferent, gently present, exactly as it should be. There is a particular, specific sensory detail worth resting on before we begin to close. The smell of fresh straw itself, warm and slightly sweet, faintly dusty, mixed with wood smoke, and the general, close warmth of a small shared room. For a medieval peasant, that particular combination of smells would have been so consistently, nightly present that it likely became, without any conscious thought at all, a direct and immediate signal to the body. This is what rest smells like. This is where the day ends. Scent works this way for us too. Even now, some particular smell, entirely its own, that your body has quietly learned to associate with safety, with softness, with the closing of a day. If you have such a smell in your own life, let it come to mind now, gently, and let it do exactly the same old work for you that straw and wood smoke once did for a peasant drifting off 8 centuries ago. One last, wider thought before the deepest quiet settles in. Every single detail we've wandered through tonight, every banked fire, every straw pallet, every murmured prayer in the watching hour, represents a single night, repeated with only small variations across many thousands of nights, across many hundreds of years, across untold thousands of individual sleepers whose names history never bothered to record. Layer upon layer of ordinary, unremarkable rest, settling quietly on top of each other like sediment, like sand gently gathering at the bottom of very still water. Each single night indistinguishable from the ones around it, and yet each one, in its own moment, exactly as real and exactly as necessary as the sleep you're settling into right now. You are not separate from all of that. You're simply the newest, most recent layer in something enormously old, still quietly settling, the same way it always has. Not every part of medieval Europe slept the same way, shaped as sleep always is by climate and geography. In the warmer regions of the south, parts of Spain, Italy, southern France, peasant households sometimes carried their bedding up onto flat rooftops during the hottest stretches of summer, sleeping briefly beneath open sky to escape the trapped, airless heat still lingering inside stone or mud brick walls after sunset. A whole household spread out beneath the stars on a warm rooftop, cooled slowly by the night air, was a completely different picture from a family huddled tight around a northern hearth against the winter cold. And yet, both were reaching for exactly the same thing, simply working with whatever their particular climate demanded of them. There's something worth noticing in that contrast. The same basic human need for rest, expressing itself in such different shapes, depending on where in the world it happened to unfold. Heat pushing people outward under open sky, cold pulling them inward around a small, shared flame. The physical exhaustion of a peasant's daily labor deserves its own quiet mention, because it likely shaped the depth and quality of sleep more than almost anything else we've discussed tonight. Hours spent bent over fields, hauling water, tending animals, working wool or wood by hand. This was a level of sustained physical effort most modern bodies rarely encounter, and it tends to produce a particular kind of sleep, heavy, deep, often free of the restless, circling thoughts that can keep a less physically tired mind awake. This isn't to say medieval life was without its own worries. It certainly wasn't. But the sheer physical demand of the day likely did some of the work that we now often ask racing minds to do alone, unassisted, without any accompanying physical tiredness to help pull the body down into rest. There's a kind of old wisdom folded into that. The reminder that a tired body has always been one of the gentlest, most reliable paths toward a mind willing, finally, to be still. Even the ghost stories and spirit tales told quietly by firelight before bed carried, more often than pure fear, a strange undercurrent of simple wonder, half-believed tales of household spirits who helped with small chores overnight in exchange for a saucer of milk left by the hearth, of ancestors watching gently over a sleeping family, of the natural world simply being more alive, more populated, more mysterious after dark than daylight ever revealed it to be. Fear had its place in these stories, certainly, but so did something closer to comfort, the sense that the dark wasn't empty at all, but quietly, benevolently company. You don't need to believe in anything in particular tonight to borrow just a little of that old comfort. The simple, old idea that the dark has never really been empty, that it has always, in one way or another, felt inhabited, watched over, gently unafraid of itself. It's worth asking gently why any of this still matters, why a pattern of sleep abandoned by most of the world centuries ago is worth wandering through tonight at all. Perhaps it's simply this: underneath every difference, the straw instead of a mattress, the banked fire instead of a thermostat, the watching hour instead of an uninterrupted 8 hours, the actual need was always exactly the same as yours is tonight. A tired body wanting rest, a quiet mind wanting permission to stop working, a soft, dark hour waiting patiently to be filled with nothing at all. That need hasn't changed in 800 years, and it isn't going to change tonight either. There's one more small thread worth following, tucked into the very last motion of the night, the moment of blowing out the final candle or rushlight. In a world without electric switches, this was a genuinely physical, deliberate act. A breath, a small extinguished flame, and then, all at once, complete and total darkness closing in around the room. There was no gradual dimming, no soft fade the way a modern light might offer. Just one instant of light, and then, immediately after, none at all. That sudden shift must have asked something small of the body each night. A brief moment of adjustment, of trusting the dark completely before the eyes had time to catch up with it. And yet it happened, night after night, in nearly every home across the medieval world. An entire continent's worth of small rooms sinking into identical darkness within moments of each other, each one trusting, without needing to see anything at all, that morning would eventually find its way back in. If the dark around you tonight feels complete, let it. You don't need to see anything right now. You only need to trust, the way that entire old world trusted, night after night after night. That morning always finds its way back, and eventually, steady, patient, and right on time. We are close to the end of tonight's wandering now, and there's no need to hold onto any particular thread of it. Whatever stayed with you, a fire being banked, a bell ringing out over darkened fields, two sleeps separated by one quiet, unhurried hour. Let it all blur gently together now into a single, soft impression, warm at the edges, with no sharp details left to hold on to. One final, quiet detail before the last hush settles fully in. Historians who study this period often note that despite the hardship, despite the cold and the long labor, and the very real dangers of the medieval world, contemporary accounts of sleep itself are rarely described with complaint. Sleep appears again and again in old records and old stories, simply as a trusted, expected relief. The reliable, nightly reward waiting at the end of whatever the day had asked of a person. It was rarely something people worried about achieving. It was simply something they knew, with quiet certainty, would come. There's something worth carrying with you from that, into your own night tonight, the plain, old confidence that rest, when the day is finally, truly finished, has always known how to arrive on its own. You don't need to chase it or worry it into being. You only need to do what every tired body across every one of those 800 years eventually did: soften, let go, and let the old, patient dark do the rest. Almost a whisper now. The fire is banked low. The children are settled. The watching hour has come and gone, or is still somewhere ahead, waiting patiently in the dark. Somewhere outside, the same stars keep their same slow, ancient watch they have always kept. And in a moment, None of this will need holding onto anymore. You've traveled gently tonight through firelight and straw, through nightcaps and watching hours, through village hearths and open shepherd's fields, through centuries of quiet, ordinary nights, not so different, underneath it all from your own. You don't need to hold onto any of it now. Let all of it soften into a loose, warm impression, the way a dream loosens the moment you stop trying to hold its shape. There's no need to remember the details. Just let the feeling of it settle, quiet and slow, somewhere low in your chest. Let your body do what it has always known how to do, long before any of tonight's stories existed. Let your breathing slow further still. Let your shoulders release whatever they've been carrying. Let your hands go loose and heavy wherever they're resting. The day, all of it, whatever it held, is finished now, and it is safe to let it go. Above you, right now, the same patient sky that watched over every hearth and pallet we visited tonight continues on exactly as it always has, steady, unhurried, entirely unbothered by the small, passing noise of any single night. It was turning long before tonight began, and it will keep turning long after you've drifted off, long after morning, long after this. Whatever you're carrying tonight is being held inside something enormously larger and enormously calm, the way it always has been, the way it always will be. Your body already knows how to rest. Sleep well.